The U.S. and South Korea are preparing for joint war drills as part of the escalation against China. Meanwhile, a recent Atlantic Council report advises the U.S. to prepare for nuclear war with North Korea and China at the same time. We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. A Chinese ICE detainee has died by suicide at a Pennsylvania detention center. 32-year-old Chao Fengge, originally from China, took his life last Tuesday by hanging himself, according to a release from the government and communications between first responders reviewed by The Intercept. Ge had been detained at Moshannon Valley Processing Center, an immigration jail run by private prison firm GEO Group, about 300 miles west of New York City. Ge had only been detained for 5 days before taking his own life. Moshannon is the largest ICE detention facility in the Northeast and has been drawing numerous complaints about abusive conditions. Among those, detainees report a lack of interpretation services, with conditions especially difficult for those who are Chinese. Without language services, Chinese detainees report feeling isolated and having to wait long periods of time, as ICE takes 5 or 6 months to arrest enough to fill a deportation flight back to China. From last October until late June of this year, 12 people nationwide had died in ICE facilities. Among the 12 deaths were at least 2 suicides. Ge's death at the Moshannon Valley Processing Center is its third. 2025 marks the final year of China's 14th five-year plan, and the Communist Party of China Central Committee is getting ready to put forward proposals for its 15th five-year plan. The CPC has received over 3 million online suggestions for consideration in the new five-year plan, which will be implemented from 2025 to 2030. The number is extraordinary, even by Chinese standards, and represents 3 times the number of suggestions made for the previous five-year plan. The online consultation was carried out from May 20th to June 20th of this year through various national platforms, such as state media websites and those of provincial or local governments, and through online apps. The suggestions received covered a range of diverse topics, such as scientific and technological innovation, diplomacy, defense, in addition to culture, rural revitalization, environment, education, employment, and common prosperity, among others. President Xi Jinping stated that the high participation and broad coverage represents an exemplary practice of comprehensive process popular democracy. President Trump has delayed high U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods from snapping back into place for another 90 days. The tariffs were set to resume on Tuesday, today, but Trump on Monday signed an executive order extending the deadline to November 9th. The delay was the expected outcome from the latest round of talks between U.S. trade negotiators and their Chinese counterparts, which took place in Stockholm in late July. Had this not been delayed, tariffs on Chinese goods would have shot up to 145%. China's latest blockbuster aims to bring greater international recognition to the 1937 Nanjing Massacre, one of Japan's worst war crimes. The film, Dead to Rights, is based on the true story of how a young apprentice in a photo studio found and developed evidence of the atrocities in secret, which was later used in a war crimes tribunal. The mass murder of civilians in the city of Nanjing, which was capital of China at the time, is widely recognized as one of the worst crimes committed by the Japanese during its occupation, which began in 1931. China has estimated the number of Chinese killed during the massacres at over 300,000 people. Released on July 25th, Dead to Rights has become a major box office hit, grossing nearly $305 million US. The film is part of a series depicting China's 14-year war of resistance against Japan. One of these movies, 731, which will be released next month, will cover the biological war crimes carried out by Unit 731. The U.S. and South Korea are preparing for their annual Ulchi Freedom Shield military exercises, which some see as a dress rehearsal for regime change in the North. To discuss these, as well as provide an update on the current political situation in South Korea, we are so pleased to have back on Ju-Hyun Park. Ju-Hyun is the web editor here at Breakthrough News. They're also a member of Nodutdol, an anti-imperialist Korean diaspora organization leading the U.S. out of Korea campaign. Ju-Hyun, welcome back to the China Report.
Thanks, Amanda. It's great to be back. It's been a minute.
Well, let's start with an update on the political situation in South Korea. A lot has happened since your last appearance a few months ago. When we last talked, then President Yoon Suk-yeol was about to be impeached. He's now been arrested and impeached, and a new president elected, President Lee Jae-Myung. Lee ran on a platform of what he called pragmatic diplomacy, of improving relations with China, of improving relations with North Korea. He also skipped the annual NATO summit this year. So a lot of people may see these developments as promising. I guess I want your take on it. Do you see the new administration as an opportunity for what they call a resetting of ROK and China relations?
Well, I do think that there are some opportunities with the new Lee Jae-Myung administration for perhaps a better relationship between the ROK or South Korea and China. However, I think it's very important not to overstate what's happening. I think in the first case, while it is true that Lee Jae-Myung ran on a platform of pragmatic diplomacy, at the same time, this was one of many things that were part of this platform, and I think it would be a far cry from reality to say that the majority of people who voted for him were primarily concerned with the relationship with China, although xenophobia was certainly mobilized by the right wing in order to try to attack him. Now, with that being said, I think that we also need to get very clear on what's really happening with the Lee Jae-Myung administration and its stance towards China and what is not. It is true that Lee Jae-Myung personally did not attend the NATO meeting. However, South Korea or the ROK as a whole did not skip out. There was still a representative that was sent to that meeting, which means that the ROK remains engaged in NATO as what they call a non-member observer state. Now, in addition to that, the ROK's relationship with China is very constrained actually by its relationship to the U.S. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that we need to understand here. What we are seeing right now is that there is some nicer rhetoric coming from both sides. I think China is very eager to take advantage of the present opportunity in order to try to seek some kind of rapprochement or however close to that they can get with the ROK. But at the same time, Washington is making its own maneuvers. One of the most important things that's happening right now as we speak and will be concretized in the coming days after Lee Jae-Myung makes his first summit with President Trump at the White House on August 25th is a possibility of redefining U.S. forces Korea's mission. Now, why does that matter to Korea's relationship to China? And that's because currently U.S. forces Korea's mission is confined to the supposed defense of South Korea from North Korea. However, there is a push from within the Pentagon, within the current U.S. administration, to alter the scope of that mission to primarily actually make it about regional defense against China. And so what this would mean is a couple of things. First off, it could open the door to the current U.S. troops that are stationed in Korea being flexibly deployed in times of war against China, which essentially brings South Korea into a battlefield of U.S. China conflict. And if something like that were to occur, then whatever pronouncements that South Korea's president makes about wanting to stay out of the Taiwan Strait conflict or wanting a more pragmatic relationship with China will ultimately be for naught if the U.S. can just pull the rug out from them at any moment and then wrap them up into a war with China in which they would be unable to avoid and unable to either decide the start or the outcome of.
Mm. Well, as you alluded to, Lee's ability to maintain a neutral stance on China is severely limited by these insane anti-China war hawks in Washington right now, and their commitment to escalating the new Cold War. I wanted to get your take. I know you've seen this report, this Atlantic Council report that was released back in May. They put out a report about how the U.S. needed to simultaneously prepare for nuclear war with both North Korea and China at the same time, even calling for the U.S. to accept the possibility of nuclear strikes within its territory in order to win the war against both. So how do you see that?
Well, I think the Atlantic Council report is really a sign of how far the U.S. ruling class has sunk into delusion. There's no such thing as limited nuclear war. I think we should start off with that. When you're talking about heavily armed nuclear states, such as the U.S. and China, and to an extent North Korea, although its arsenal is not nearly as large as either of these countries, you're talking about the capacities to end all life on Earth. So even approaching that sort of a conflict, I think this limited word is really just a fig leaf for what is really a very apocalyptic scenario. And I think that it tells us a lot about the crisis that the US is in at the world scale in terms of its ability to maintain hegemony, to maintain empire in the long term. Of course, right now, we all understand that US imperialism is still quite powerful. But I think that when they look to a competitor like China and they talk about the need for war with China, what they are really thinking about is the longevity of their project, the longevity of their power. And the Atlantic Council report, I think, is very telling because it not only has this very particular language, which I'm going to cite exactly as saying the United States should prepare for the possibility of limited nuclear attack, unquote. But in addition to that, what they specifically identify as a result of US military drills in the Pacific, specifically referring to Guardian Tiger 1 and 2, is a conclusion that the US actually cannot divide China and the DPRK or North Korea from one another. It can't seek out a scenario where it does war against one party and then war against the other as a way to sort of make the conflicts more manageable. What it's concluding is that simultaneous war is the only possibility. And so I think that even in the face of those major obstacles, even in the face of the horrendous consequences that would result from even a so-called limited nuclear war, what we're seeing is that the leading intellectuals of the US empire, the leading decision makers, the policy makers are kind of coming together and cohering around this position that, you know what, all that risk to human life, all that risk to the United States, to the people of the Pacific and Asia is fundamentally worth it in order to keep the gears of our current political system running. And I think that that sort of thing should send a really chilling reaction to anyone who hears it. And I think it should wake us all up to the reality that we need a much stronger movement against war and against imperialism in this country. Because if we think that what we're seeing today in terms of the genocide in Gaza, in terms of all these examples of US atrocities or US sponsored atrocities happening all around the world, if we think that that by itself is already horrendous enough, then I think that we frankly don't understand the kinds of nightmares that the US ruling class would like to bring into fruition, and that we have a responsibility to stop.
I want to talk to you about building a stronger anti-imperialist movement in the US in just a bit. But first, I want to talk about, we're 8 months into the new Trump administration, and, he has, his foreign policy is crazy. He recently demanded that South Korea raise its military budget and pay for its own occupation. So I guess I want to ask you, 8 months in, can you talk a bit about popular sentiment in South Korea regarding this new administration? What are people feeling on the ground?
Well, we are not yet at a point where we have really definitive numbers, but I think that anecdotally from a lot of organizers on the ground and in terms of what we're seeing, even in the bourgeois Korean press, there is a growing anti-US sentiment and a lot of popular resentment towards the United States. Now, whether that is particularly affixed more at Trump than at the US, I do believe that that's currently the case. There's a lot of bewilderment in terms of the way that the Trump administration is treating South Korea, and a lot of questions that are then arising. Is this a good relationship? Is this an ally that is dependable? Or is this just an economic predator, quite frankly? And I think that that has a lot to do not only with the particular military demands that Trump is making, but also actually the recent tariff deal, which was made between South Korea and the United States, which there will be more details about after the Lee-Trump summit on August 25th. Now, just to give a full sort of breakdown of everything that's on the table here, let's just start with the tariff deal itself and how it's affecting South Korea. So previously, the US and South Korea signed a free trade agreement back in 2007. So what that meant was that South Korean exports to the US, for the most part, did not face any sort of trade barriers to entering the US market. Now, was that free trade agreement actually good for South Korean workers? I would argue no. However, that was the sort of status quo. It was what the kind of economic activity of South Korea was largely built around. What we had seen in the past few years was that there was a very concerted attempt by the US, including under the Biden administration, to make tariff threats under things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, in order to pressure South Korean conglomerates to move their production to the United States and also to diminish their commercial ties with China. And as a result of that, there was actually a shift where China, which had previously been the number one trade partner of the US, sank to the number 2 position and was replaced by the United States. Now, what the Trump administration has done is taken that existing status quo and erected this barrier of 15% tariffs across the board for all South Korean exports, which is going to have an economy-wide effect on South Korea because of the importance of the US market to the profitability of Korean capitalism. Now, in addition to that, there are a number of sector-based tariffs that technically apply to all countries, but in the case of South Korea, really target the pillars of its industrial economy. I'm talking 50% tariffs on aluminum and steel, which are really the foundations of having any kind of domestic industry. I believe it's a 15% tariff on autos, and there were recently announced 100% tariffs on semiconductors, right? So these are all major industries in South Korea that are now facing threats to their long-term profitability. And essentially, there need to be negotiations between the South Korean government and the US in order to figure out how those companies are going to stay profitable. And the answer is often to invest in the US, to move production to the US. And that's really being spelled out in the other components of this tariff deal, because it's not just this 15% imposition. Meanwhile, I need to add, US goods currently face no tariff barriers to entering the Korean market. In addition to that, the South Korean government has agreed on a $350 billion investment into the United States, particularly in industry. $150 billion of that is earmarked for shipbuilding in particular, which is a very crucial and important industry in South Korea. And in addition to that, a lot of those other investments are going to go into strategic next generation sectors like semiconductors, biotechnology, nuclear energy even. And so what we're seeing is that the US is really going for the major kind of pillars of South Korea's economy and the industries that will secure its global position well into the future. And essentially, it's pulling out the rug from underneath South Korea and creating a lot of incentive for particularly a lot of the most productive and most profitable sectors of those industries to now move to the US. What this is going to do is essentially push South Korea down on the global value chain. It's going to undercut its ability to have economic prosperity, not only in the present, but also into the future. It's essentially creating a crisis of capitalism in the longer term in order to generate short-term gains strategically for the United States and for the profitability of capitalism here. Now, that $350 billion is, I think, a major sticking point. We're talking about more than half of the annual budget of the entire South Korean government. And it's not just that $350 billion, because there's an additional $100 billion deal to purchase US liquid natural gas, which is some of the most expensive natural gas on the market. South Korea could get cheaper sources, particularly from Russia. Instead, they're locked into this major commitment on energy, which also affects all industries in the economy. It affects consumers in the economy. And so now you have a $450 billion wealth transfer from the pockets of South Korean workers directly into Wall Street. This is something like more than a quarter of the entire annual nominal GDP of South Korea as a country. So this is just absolute highway robbery. There's no other way to spin it. I think that many people in South Korea, even without understanding all the ins and outs of the details of the deal, you just look at the raw figures and it's absolutely astounding. It's absolutely mind-boggling what it's going to do to South Korea's economy in the short term and in the long term. So there is a lot of popular anger that's being generated over that. I think that the question that now remains is, will that be directed into a real popular movement to politically change South Korea, for one, and secondly, will it actually result in any kind of pivot from the Lee Jae-Myung administration to seek to diversify its relationships with other countries, to kind of expand the basis through which it can not only seek business abroad, but also political legitimacy abroad? And I think whether or not first the people of South Korea and then the government of South Korea respond in those ways are really going to determine what the end results of these current negotiations are going to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, last time you came on the show in the spring, you talked a bit about the joint U.S. South Korea military exercises on the peninsula. Now, the two are getting ready for another set of war drills, the Ulchi Freedom Shield military exercises, which run from August 18th to the 28th. So can you tell us more about these war drills and what they entail? How do they differ from the previous ones? What do they look like?
So the US and South Korea hold hundreds of drills in the peninsula every single year. And there are two major points where especially large series of war drills occur. And that's both large by volume. It's large in the sense of like the number of troops that they're deploying. And in addition to that, these are often when some of the most provocative exercises occur. So that's Freedom Shield in March and Ulchi Freedom Shield in August. They're not very creative when it comes to the naming of these things. Now, Ulchi Freedom Shield and Freedom Shield share a lot of similarities, but I think essentially the most important things to understand about them is that these are the times when the US is most likely to rehearse drills that essentially practice the invasion and occupation of the DPRK. And in past years, what we've seen is an increasing number of rehearsals of nuclear war scenarios, which include the deployment of US nuclear weapons to Korea. Now, they don't actually say whether or not they are doing that as part of these exercises, but they do let us know, not as us as in Nodutdol, but through the media, they do tell the press when they are doing exercises that involve any kind of coordination between South Korea and the United States on the deployment of nuclear assets. And that tends to happen around these times of year. And as a result of that, it's really these war exercises that are the most provocative, the biggest source of ongoing tensions with North Korea, because North Korea understandably views these as fundamentally hostile acts. And I think that it's very important for us to all understand that, these are fundamentally aggressive, provocative maneuvers that are designed to keep tensions high. Now, one thing that is occurring actually this year is that the US and South Korea have gone ahead and announced that they will be, quote unquote, scaling back the Ulchi Freedom Shield exercises. Now, what they actually mean by that is that they're actually just distributing some of the more provocative exercises to later times in the calendar year. They're going to postpone a number of their battalion level field exercises and some of their other exercises, which would involve large numbers of troops, potentially particularly threatening weapon systems like aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, the kinds of things that they've used in the past. But I think that what's important to understand is that that is actually not going to be enough in order to signal to Pyongyang that any kind of renewed dialogue is possible. And I think that decision makers in both Seoul and Washington understand that. This is really just a response to the fact that Kim Yo-jong, the deputy chairperson of the Workers' Party of Korea, recently issued a statement where she said, and this was the first DPRK or North Korean statement about the new Lee Jae-Myung government, that they did not view the new government as any different from the prior government. And that, particularly because Ulchi Freedom Shield is moving forward, they do not consider the possibility of dialogue with either South Korea or the US to be possible. And so I think that, as a result of that, both administrations are sort of maneuvering because they do share this objective of trying to rekindle dialogue in the first place. And secondly, they are wary of perceptions that, they're receiving clear signals not to do something that will make a situation worse and that they are moving forward with it anyway. So they're, I think, essentially trying to retain some of the basis to be seen as the more reasonable party without sacrificing their broader strategic objective of maintaining tensions, of increasing military coordination. One could say that the US and South Korea are even so-called scaling back for the sake of optics because they do have a lot of political legitimacy resting on the idea that they are pursuing dialogue with North Korea. I think simultaneously, though, what's also happening, and I referenced this earlier on in our discussion, is that the US and South Korea are at a bit of a turning point in their relationship. It's not only because of these tariff threats, it's really because of a changing overall strategy that the US government is pursuing in the region that places far more emphasis on the US's ability to confront China, far less emphasis on becoming directly involved in conflicts with North Korea. And at the same time, the US actually cannot pursue that strategy in a way where it loses South Korea as a close partner. So I think there's a lot of negotiation that's occurring at this moment. One of the things that a lot of observers are curious about is to whether or not the upcoming Lee-Trump summit on August 25th will result in further progress on the transfer of operational wartime command. This is something that various liberal South Korean presidents have requested since the early 2000s. There's technically been a process in place since that time to actually transfer operational wartime control from the US to South Korea over its own military, which in the first case, it's absurd that South Korea, a so-called independent country, does not control its own military in times of war. But one of the stipulations and sort of hurdles that South Korea needs to overcome, and this is a very, very colonial, condescending, sort of chauvinistic mindset, is that South Korea needs to prove its capacity to command its own forces and to be a reliable partner in defense for the United States. And the main mechanism, the main vehicle for it to do that over all this time has been these war games. That is a lot of the reason why various South Korean liberal administrations have remained engaged in the war games. And so there's a fundamental contradiction occurring where, on the one hand, the more of these war games occur, the more tensions with North Korea rise, the more the possibility of war rises on the peninsula. Simultaneously, the only way for South Korean liberal administrations, well, not the only way, but the way that has been kind of charted through the sort of existing administrative process, is to go along with these war games and then through a gradual process prove, their ability to essentially be trusted to command their own military. And so it's this very paradoxical situation that I think is occurring within the alliance, within South Korea's position relative to the U.S. And we're seeing all of that play out now in terms of how Ulchi Freedom Shield is being carried out in a way that is attempting to sort of balance all of these different competing needs, and then as a result of trying to do that, probably not really succeeding in achieving any of them.
Well, Nodutdol just came off the heels of your historic People's Summit for Korea. It was a major success. So congratulations.
Thank you.
It was a 2-day gathering of progressive and anti-imperialist organizations to renew commitment to Korean liberation and just in general challenge U.S. imperialism in the Pacific. What I appreciated about the summit was how it united all of these different national liberation struggles, Korea, Hawaii, Philippines, to stop the U.S. war drive against China. And I remember one of the speakers on one of the panels, he said, as we enter a new phase of this American confrontation against China, it is critical for us to remember that this was always the end goal. Their plan has always been confrontation with Asia and China. So I think it's really easy to see all of these national liberation struggles in isolation. But the fact is the U.S. is just trying to turn the entire Pacific into a front line for war with China. And each of these places becomes a launching point for that war. So bringing it back to Ulchi Freedom Shield, yes, they are a dress rehearsal for regime change in North Korea, but it's also important to recognize that these war games are critical to the escalation of war with China, as you mentioned earlier.
I'm really glad you brought in this element. I do think something that's important to note is that Ulchi Freedom Shield as a war exercise series is razor focused on North Korea. However, there's this broader question of how U.S. forces Korea or the U.S. occupation of Korea fits into the project of Indo-Pacific Empire. And I think to really illustrate that, we should look to a map that U.S. forces Korea has been found by the Korean media to be using in the training of its own troops. Now, what you'll see here is essentially an upside down map of East Asia, or Northeast Asia to be particular. And this map is oriented in such a way that the Korean peninsula sits right in the center, and there are a series of lines emerging from Camp Humphreys in Pyeongtaek, which is on the west coast of the Korean peninsula. Camp Humphreys is the largest U.S. military base outside of the continental U.S. And there's a series of distance lines that are drawn to Vladivostok, to Beijing, to Hanoi, to Taiwan, to the Philippines. And what this is really demonstrating is the centrality of the Korean peninsula at the heart as a pivot point in Northeast Asia, and therefore a very effective platform from which the U.S. can project its power. There were some statements that were made earlier this year by U.S. Forces Korea Commander General Xavier Brunson, in which he described the Korean peninsula as, quote, a fixed aircraft carrier floating between Japan and China. And I think that, this is very demonstrative of the way in which the U.S. military, the way in which U.S. imperialism sees its interests in Korea as part of this broader puzzle to achieve the domination of Asia. And so I think that, that really goes back to this sort of question of redefining U.S. Forces Korea mission that I brought up earlier on, which is going to be a major point of discussion between President Lee and President Trump. And that really is because, the U.S. is facing the situation where it is so bogged down by many of the security commitments it has in Korea concerning the DPRK or North Korea, and at the same time, strategically, it needs to pivot in order to focus more on confrontation with China. And in order to do that, one of the things it would need to do, and I think this will be very interesting to see over the coming weeks, is possibly even scale down the total number of troops it has in Korea. Because while Korea is still in many ways the tip of the spear, it's the most effective pivot point from which to launch potential attacks into like different parts of what the US sees as this one battlefield of the entire coast of Asia. In spite of all of that, the US also wants to maybe not overinvest the number of troops that it has in the Korean Peninsula in the result of a war, which tells us a couple of things. One, it's that, they are taking the possibility of confrontation with China very seriously. And two, they also see that Korea would not escape that kind of conflict. And really, they have no intention of having that be the case. And so I think that, that should really startle a lot of people, especially Korean people. I think it should rouse us to consider how Korea is effectively being used as cannon fodder, effectively being set up to get roped into this war that really has nothing to do with the interests of Korean people, in order to serve what the US and Washington and its ruling class see as this project to, maintain capitalism indefinitely in the region, to dominate the area militarily, to squash the rise of any kind of sovereign movements. And I think that, it should raise a lot of concerns as to like what kind of future is really possible with this close of a relationship with the United States. So, we will see what exactly transpires out of that Lee-Trump summit coming up in just a few days. But I think, it's probably safe to say that the outcome will not be very beneficial for the Korean people, economically, militarily, politically. And, while it is probably the case that those things, just are going to happen at this point, I think the question that we should all be asking ourselves is, all right, well, how are we going to secure a future in the longer term? Is the best way to have safety for Korean people to have this permanent state of division, this permanent state of brinksmanship, to essentially be used as the sort of forward position for the defense of the US mainland, as the US seeks to provoke a military conflict with China in order to essentially secure its domination on the world stage? Is that really beneficial for Korean people, or is it really only beneficial for Wall Street, for the military industrial complex, for the shareholders of these companies? And, if the latter is the case, then, how are we going to actually build a popular movement within the peninsula and other parts of the world where, Korean people are concentrated, in order to try to sort of effectively steer the course of history in a way that's not only to the benefit of us as Koreans, but really, I would argue, for the majority of humanity. I don't think a major confrontation in East Asia is what's needed right now. I don't think it's helpful for people in any part of the world, especially if it rises to the level of a nuclear confrontation, which, as we've already mentioned, is not considered out of the realm of possibility by a lot of US think tanks and war planners.
No, it's all very, very alarming. But going back to your point about building popular movements, these war drills are held every year. Can you talk a bit about how Korean people, both on the peninsula and in the diaspora, how are they responding to this kind of escalation? How is Nodutdol responding to these kinds of escalations?
Well, one of the most important things that's coming up is August 15th, which this year will mark 80 years since the end of Japanese colonialism in Korea. This is called Liberation Day. That particular phrase now has a lot of weird meanings associated with it, thanks to the Trump administration using it for tariffs and now to essentially declare martial law in Washington, D.C. That is what it's referred to. And what's going to occur in South Korea is that we have some of the largest labor unions under the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, a lot of the progressive civic organizations, student groups, farmers and women's organizations that are all coming together for major mobilizations. And what they are seeking are a number of things. They want an end to, these constant U.S. military exercises and war threats, particularly Ulchi Freedom Shield, which starts on August 18th, just a few days later. They want to register mass protest against the existing terms of the tariff deal and what's expected to come further down the road. And they're also pushing for the continued prosecution and political removal of the forces behind Yoon Suk-yeol's coup, many of whom are still embedded within certain parts of the government. This is really a mass demand that, everyone involved in the attempt to extinguish, what partial democracy exists in South Korea needs to be held to account for those things. And so as a result of that, Nodutdol and a number of our partners in the U.S. Out of Korea campaign, we are coordinating protests in 6 U.S. cities, in New York, in Oakland, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, in Seattle, and even in Washington, D.C. And that'll be happening on Friday and on Saturday. I highly recommend that people go to the Nodutdol Instagram page in order to learn more. Nodutdol is, of course, spelled Nodutdol. And we'll be talking about a lot of the different aspects of what the Korean people are facing in this moment, not only from the threat of war and the economic coercion and exploitation occurring under the tariff deal, but even some of the other sorts of things that are yet to come, which we'll see out of the Lee and Trump summit. One thing that I was not able to get to much in this conversation is that, although you did reference it, is that the U.S. is trying to get all of its so-called allies to increase their defense spending to 5% of GDP. Right. That is a massive figure for any kind of economy at all. In the case of South Korea, we would be talking about an $87 billion investment into war, which the Trump administration is simultaneously trying to pressure South Korea into making further commitments to buy U.S. arms. So again, this is just another wealth transfer from Korean taxpayers into the pockets of Wall Street. But then even then, the U.S. is not satisfied because they are trying to change the terms of the Special Measures Agreement, which is a accord between the South Korean and the American government concerning the costs of the U.S. military occupation. And they're now trying to foist a $10 billion annual payment from South Korea's government to the U.S. It would not go into the U.S. military budget, actually. It would go directly into the U.S. Treasury. And on top of that, South Korea has already been paying close to $1 billion a year in these direct payments for a number of years. And that doesn't even include the number of other costs that are associated with the U.S. military occupation. We're talking pollution to the land and water, which South Koreans have to pay the cleanup for. Even around Camp Humphreys, and I learned this, touring the area with some local activists, the costs of recycling and trash takeout by the base are not covered by the base. It's the city of Pyeongtaek that pays for that, which means that it's essentially the everyday residents of that city who are already dealing with this massive U.S. military presence who have to pay for the garbage of these soldiers because they're too lazy to abide by South Korean recycling laws and, sort their compost from their plastics and paper and everything else that they're required to do. And so, I think when Donald Trump walks around and says, South Korea's taken advantage of us, the so-called money machine, they're not paying their fair share, that is, it's complete baloney. The reality of it is that the U.S. has already been exploiting Korea for some time. They have already been benefiting the most politically from the situation. And South Koreans have been paying directly out of their pockets, not to mention the cost to their health, to their safety, by the presence of U.S. forces. And I think that, it's time to thoroughly reject the narrative that there has been any kind of taking advantage by the Korean people of so-called U.S. generosity. And on top of that, everything that the Trump administration says is going to benefit U.S. workers, that, the tariff deal will bring jobs to the U.S. and such and such. I think we've been through enough major bailouts of Wall Street to understand that those things do not help workers. If anything, our conditions get worse every single time the U.S. government finds some way to flush hundreds of billions of dollars into the market directly into the pockets of the largest investors and capitalists in this country. And that's essentially what's happening with this tariff deal right now. Only instead of that directly draining out of the U.S. Tax base, the U.S. is now essentially coordinating these kinds of tribute payments. Like there's some kind of, old emperors from the days of yore. And then that's what's directly going into empowering the ruling class, into the people oppressing us, raising our rent, raising our utilities, allowing inflation to run away while keeping our wages low. So I think we need to wake up to the reality that our class interests put us with the majority of the world, not with this tiny group of elites who have already wreaked so much havoc on the world and on our lives in particular. And that, we need to be united in looking for an alternative and looking for a way to build a different kind of economy that's not based on war, that's not based on exploitation, but really just fulfilling people's needs and finding a way to have common prosperity.
Well, amen. Ju-Hyun Park, it's always great to have you on the China Report. Maybe to end, you could let people know first where to find your work and how can people get involved with Nodutdol and the U.S. Out of Korea campaign.
Yeah, for the U.S. Out of Korea campaign, you can go to usoutofkorea.org. For Nodutdol, also there's a website, nodutdol.org, nodutdol.org. I would really recommend, if you're part of an organization, to talk about endorsing the U.S. Out of Korea campaign, joining up with us. You can participate in everything that we're doing. If you're not part of an organization, then I think the first step is to
join an organization.
Yes, join an organization. You can join Nodutdol, but there's also many other organizations that are out there that are just as good to join. And I think that, the point of it is that we need to start working towards building a movement. And what that means is that we need to make politics every day of our lives and commit ourselves to doing that. And doing that with others is the most important first step.
Thank you so much. Well, as China's population ages, the government has been trying to boost its silver economy. This includes the development of services and classes for the elderly, like these drumming lessons you'll see in this video. This clip comes courtesy of China Insider, and according to them, at a drum studio in Yunnan, a growing number of retired women are joining weekly drumming classes. And the best part? It costs less than 500 renminbi a month to join. That's cheaper than a gym membership and 100 times louder. That's our show. If you like this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.